Welcome to the Braveheart podcast. This month on our gospel perspective, we are focusing on being radical. I want you to think about the most radical person that you know and then ask yourself, did they look like Jesus? Jesus is the most radical person that has ever walked the earth. And this month, we're going to focus on that. So we're praying for you. Share this with a friend. I'm sure it's going to bless them. And make sure to stick till the end.
What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of The Gospel Perspective. I am so glad you're tuning in. I'm really excited to share this one with you. We had an amazing experience. Our team, we had a summer intensive this summer. We went to Cincinnati, Ohio for an event. There was a group of about 24 of us that had just been running together, and we had a heck of a time trying to get home from Cincinnati to Dallas. Our flights were delayed, canceled, and ultimately we had to rent cars, spend the night and rent cars and drive all the way back to Dallas from Cincinnati, Ohio. And when I was in the hotel the next morning and I was just praying, I was on the treadmill, the Lord spoke a phrase to me that really instigated this episode. And he said this, he said, "Peter, stead is the new fast." And it was a play on words about steadfast, being steadfast. And he was telling me that if you want to go fast in the days to come, you have to remain steady. You have to remain faithful. And we began to talk and pray into this. And so this week's gospel perspective is called the gospel perspective on how to be radical. And I want to read a definition to you of being radical, because being radical is a concept in our culture that I think is celebrated. Everyone wants to be radical. No one wants to be normal. No one wants to be just traditional and boring and ho-hum. We want to be radical. We want to be on fire. And so I wanted to read this. Radical, very simple definition is this: very different from the usual or traditional. And so to get a gospel perspective on being radical, though, we've got to understand that it first starts with Jesus. Jesus is the most radical one that ever lived, the most radical human being. And so to have a gospel perspective, you'll hear this every episode, you have to have a perspective that looks at this concept through the lens of Jesus. And so I'm going to highlight one of the aspects of Jesus' life that I believe was incredibly radical, especially so for today in our culture, our Christian culture, and the culture that we're living in. And it's this: it's being faithful. I believe that the true radical ones today are the ones who are faithful. Now, this is hard to quantify, this is hard to celebrate, this is hard to really recognize, because being faithful really looks like doing the same thing consistently, day in and day out, for years and years and years on end, sometimes with little to no evidence that there's this massive thing happening. But Hebrews chapter 3 says this: it says that Jesus was faithful to him who appointed him. And what does that mean? It means that the Father gave Jesus an assignment. He gave him a calling. He gave him things to do. He gave him objectives, and he was faithful to that. He didn't deviate to the left or to the right. He kept his heart and his mind and his life on track with the purposes of God. And so this is something that I'm finding today is very radical, meaning it's not usual. Passion isn't necessarily radical. There's a lot of passionate people in the earth today, passionate about different things, passionate about different movements. You can be passionate about health. You can be passionate about social justice. You can be passionate about so many things. And so passion isn't necessarily radical. You can't just say, well, I'm radical because I'm passionate. True radical Christianity is being faithful, meaning faithful brothers and sisters are hard to find. And I'm going to read this. This is actually in the Bible. Proverbs 20 verse 6 says this: "Many a man proclaims his own steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find?" Wow. He's saying, where are my faithful ones? Where are the ones who will show up day in and day out and not change the subject every 6 months because they get bored, because they want something new? Sometimes I think we sense that that God's always having to say something new. And so you end up every 6 months, you just take a left turn and then a right turn, and you say you're following God, but in reality, you may just be following what's new because you're uncomfortable being faithful. And listen, if that's you, there's so much grace for you. God gives us, like His disciples were always wanting to do the next thing and do the new thing, and they weren't ever quite getting with the program. And so I hope this encourages you. I'm going to read a few more scriptures because this is a big deal. Being faithful is not something that we can muster up on our own strength. It comes from seeing that Jesus, first and foremost, was faithful to the Father, and He's faithful to us in covenant. And so when you see that, it'll give you great courage and strength to be faithful in what God's called you to do. Listen to this, Hosea 4:1. This is really heavy, but this is really encouraging. It says this, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land." The Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. "There is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land." And so God is looking at the people of Israel and He's going, wow, where are the faithful ones? Where is steadfast love? Where is the knowledge of me in the land? And so I really felt compelled to share this word, this perspective on being radical, because I want to charge you, if you really, really want to be radical, Hebrews 6 says, "Then imitate those who through faith and patience inherited the promises." And what does that mean? Faith looks like, I believe God's going to do it. Faith is like, not I just believe, I know, like God's going to do the thing. And many of us love having faith. We're like, I have faith. And maybe for a week or a month or 2 months, you're like, I believe. And then 6 months goes by and you don't see the thing happen. You're like, well, maybe I don't believe anymore. Maybe God's not, maybe, and it's 6 months and you're like ready to throw in the towel. But the Bible says this, it says through faith and patience, they inherit the promises. And some of us with faith, the big faith muscle people, we're like, oh, those people, they have patience. They're just waiting by and by. And there are people and they just patiently, they're like, well, we're just patiently waiting, brother. And I think God will do it, but I don't know, but we're just going to be patient. And there's no faith, and their hearts get dull and their hearts get crusty, but they're being patient. And really that's not patient. That's just a numb, dull heart. But there's something when you marry faith, which is this eager, like substance of knowing that God will do what He said He will do. He'll perform His word. The kingdom of God's coming. He's going to break in. He's going to break out. But it's married and coupled in humility with a patience to say, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, listen, my God's going to save me from the fire. But even if He doesn't, I'm going to hold fast. I'm not going to bow to you, King. My faithfulness is not contingent upon outcomes. My faithfulness is contingent upon a man that hell, high water, death, separation, tribulation, nothing will keep me from my God. And so I want to give you a few practicals, because if that's you, if you found yourself, you're like, man, I want to live radical for God. I want to be on fire for God. I want to position you to be on fire for a long time so you don't burn out. Many people are claiming to be radical, but then they're burning out. And you don't burn out with faithfulness. Faithfulness looks like you just stay steadfast in the love of God, in His purposes for your life. And so the number one practical I want to give you is this. You have to see that Jesus is faithful to you and to the covenant that He made with you. He will not break covenant with you. So in order for you to remain faithful, you have to first see that the faithful one is married to you. And so you're not going to be faithful by looking at your schedule, by looking at what's on your to-do list, by looking at all the things you have to do. You're going to first and foremost be faithful by seeing that you have a faithful one that is with you that all the time, that His life has been bestowed to you by the Spirit, that through communion with Him, you actually are hardwired for faithfulness. You are hardwired for steadfast love. Why? Because God's Spirit dwells inside of you. This is an amazing, beautiful truth. Number two, this is really important. In order to be faithful, you actually have to befriend faithfulness. And I'm going to read this out of the Psalms. This is such a cool psalm. 37:3 says, trust in the Lord. Again, that's keeping your eyes on Him. And do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. This means To befriend something or someone means that you actually take some effort and you've got to open your heart up to them. If you've ever tried to make a friend that you're like, oh man, I think I would be friends with that person. You try to befriend them. You try to get to know them. You share your heart. You want to get to know their heart. And so you've got to be willing to open up your life in your heart for faithfulness to examine your heart and go, wow, you want to be friends with me, but you're not being faithful. And you've got to allow faithfulness, which is God Himself, to speak into your life honestly. Because if you pretend that you're faithful, but you're not, you can't actually move anywhere. That's called pride, and God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. And so first and foremost, to make any progress in the kingdom, you have to be willing to examine your life and let the Spirit of God examine you and say, hey, you're not being faithful here. And He doesn't share that with you to condemn you. He shares it with you to call you higher and to actually become friends with you in the fellowship with the Son. And so befriend faithfulness. Number 3, you have to find your purpose in your calling. Many people, they don't know how to be faithful because they actually don't know where they're going. To be faithful, you have to have vision. You have to have an end in sight. The reason many people lose faith is because they lose sight of where they're going. And for me personally, one of the strongest anchors for my life in doing what I'm doing, running with the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, is this. I have fixed in my heart that there is a day when Jesus is coming back. A real man, a real king, a rider on the white horse, all the things. And the best I know how, and I do this very feebly, I do this very, probably not as well as you think I do it, but I try to remind myself that there is a finish line I'm running towards. I'm running towards this moment, this day. There is a day that I want to be faithful with every breath He's given me. I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to mess around with sin. I don't want to mess around with compromise. I want to keep my life on the straight and the narrow, not because I have to, but because I get to. And there's a finish line that I'm running towards. And this is what I want to hear on that day. Well done, good and faithful servant. I can't imagine a greater reward. He says, well done. Listen, good and faithful servant. He doesn't say, well done, good and radical servant. He doesn't say, well done, good and powerful servant. He doesn't say, well done, good and authoritative servant. He says, well done, good and faithful servant. You stewarded what I gave you to steward. You didn't compare your life with someone else. You didn't try to steward someone else's calling. You stayed true to what I gave to you. And so if you are lost and you are blind and you are confused about your calling, we actually have an episode on that. You can go watch the Gospel Perspective on finding your calling. But the reality is this, you have to get alone with God and you've got to find that anchor for your life. And then God will begin to show you the things you can do that will actually serve that finish line. I hope that makes sense to you, meaning that there are things that you can do every single day that will cause you to grow into Christ-likeness and actually steward the assignment that God's given you. And so I pray this encourages you, and I pray this actually gives you a new framework for what it means to be radical in this day. A faithful brother who can find. And my prayer is this, that God will raise up faithful sons and daughters who will run well, not just for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but for decades upon decades, that the fire of God in their hearts will burn brighter and brighter until the Lord comes. I love you guys so much. I believe in you. Keep running.
Stead is the new fast. And so being faithful to what God has asked you is actually the most radical thing you can do. So many times we think it's just passion and doing things that look extraordinary, but look at Jesus. He was steadfast, and so can you. So we want to go ahead and exhort you to share this with a friend, post it on your social, and then follow us on our social platforms as well so you can keep up with all the content that's coming out on the Braveheart podcast. We love you and we're praying for you. See you next week.